A poor young man won the Christmas lottery and decided to keep it a secret. When his girlfriend found the winning ticket hidden in his home, what she did next left him ruined. The sun seeped weakly through the worn curtains, casting faint shadows over the old furniture scattered around the small apartment. It was a simple place, its walls peeling and its tiled floors worn, yet each object seemed to carry its own story. The table with one wobbly leg reinforced by scraps of cardboard, the chairs that creaked when sat upon, the dining room cabinet whose shelf slanted slightly under the weight of inherited dinnerware. This was the home of Josh and Suzanne, a couple who, despite their financial limitations, managed to maintain a certain warmth in their day-to-day lives. That morning, like almost every morning, Josh had risen first. The silence of dawn accompanied him as he completed the same tasks he had been repeating for years. In the tiny kitchen, he lit the small burner carefully, heating water for coffee and checking on the stale bread they kept wrapped in a clean napkin. The coffee pot let out a soft gurgle, filling the air with that familiar aroma so comforting to them. Before Suzanne opened her eyes, he had already tidied the small dining table, making sure nothing was missing. Shortly afterward, Suzanne got up, guided by the smell of coffee and the murmuring of the street as it slowly came to life. Their neighborhood, humble and tightly packed with houses, was beginning its daily rhythm. She walked slowly toward the dining room, her hair still messy, her face drowsy, but wearing a faint smile at the sight of Josh leaning over the table, arranging the cups. Without exchanging many words, they both took their seats. Suzanne wrapped her hands around the steaming mug, grateful for the warmth that seeped through the porcelain. Josh, his gaze calm, broke the hard bread in half, toasted it slightly, and offered one piece to his companion. There was no butter or jam, only that toasted bread and coffee. But the way they looked at each other, between sips and small bites, sketched a complicity any stranger would have envied. As daylight intensified, the noises of the neighborhood invaded the space. The garbage truck, the voice of a neighbor calling a tardy child to school, a distant radio playing an old song. The apartment bore witness to a scene both routine and yet charged with discreet, sincere affection. Though their finances did not allow for luxuries, they had each other. Their lives, woven from hard jobs and predictable days, were held together by a delicate balance. Perhaps they were not happy in any grandiose sense, but they maintained an honest serenity that, in the midst of scarcity, proved invaluable. Once their brief breakfast was finished, Josh got up first and brushed the crumbs off the tablecloth with his hand. He placed the chairs back in order, gently touching the back of the one Suzanne had occupied, as though dedicating to her a silent, affectionate gesture. Then he prepared to leave. He wore the same outfit as always, sturdy pants, a somewhat worn t-shirt, boots that had seen several winters. His job involved loading boxes in a warehouse, a routine employment that barely covered their monthly expenses, but propped up their fragile household economy. Meanwhile, Suzanne mentally organized her day's house-cleaning jobs. She would visit several homes throughout the day, scrubbing floors, dusting furniture, tidying spaces that did not belong to her, all in order to contribute just enough for them to get by. Right before Josh stepped through the door, they paused for an instant, standing face to face, looking into each other's eyes. There were no words or promises, only that exchange of knowing glances, as if silently passing strength back and forth, understanding that their difficulties were temporary and that, as long as they remained together, they could face the challenges of the day that was just beginning. Then Josh left, and Suzanne, with a soft sigh, prepared to start her own workday. The apartment settled into a relative silence, with the faint aroma of coffee still lingering in the air, a mute witness to a relationship seeking dignity within simplicity. As the day advanced, the mild morning light yielded to a firmer sun, intensifying reflections on the neighborhood's streets. In the warehouse where Josh worked, the hours slid by slowly amid dust and the monotonous racket of carts rolling over the concrete floor. He, his back already aching, struggled to keep up the pace. He lifted boxes of various sizes, stacking them carefully and precisely. Sweat beaded on his forehead, dampening the worn fabric of his t-shirt, while his thoughts raced faster than his hands. The heaviest load was not the boxes, though they strained his arms, but the intangible weight of unpaid bills, mounting debts, and the narrow margin they had before expenses devoured their meager earnings. Each time he lifted a box, his mind tallied the problems: rent, electricity, gas, food. He knew any slip, any misstep could put them in check. For that reason, he worked in silence, avoiding distractions, focusing on each movement. He dared not look beyond a week into the future. The present was demanding enough. Hour after hour, he hoisted weights onto high shelves, striving not to let despair cloud his gaze. Meanwhile, Suzanne found herself far from there, moving through other streets, knocking on strangers' doors, presenting herself with her bag of cleaning supplies and a subdued smile. She was received with varying moods. In some houses, they greeted her cordially, offering a glass of water. In others, just a condescending nod and a look that made her feel small, reminding her of her precarious position. She cleaned diligently, battling grime, dust, and the traces of everyday use. Her body bent over floors to scrub, stretched to reach high shelves, crouched to pick up invisible crumbs. But it was some people's attitudes that weighed heavier on her than any chore. Comments that were sometimes haughty, other times simply indifferent, reminded her that her place on the social ladder was fragile. Still, Suzanne forced herself to remain composed. She knew she needed that income, however meager, to stay afloat with Josh. Throughout the day, the concept of precariousness hovered like a transparent veil between them, separating what they desired from what the world offered. As Josh lifted boxes and Suzanne polished someone else's floors, their minds drifted between memories of even harder times and the hope that their efforts wouldn't be in vain. Both knew they lived on a thin tightrope, held up by an unstable balance. And yet, they clung to the conviction that their love, the silent understanding they shared, was a refuge against the harshness of everyday life. By late afternoon, as the sun retreated languidly and the streets took on an orange hue, Josh and Suzanne returned to the apartment. Exhausted, with tense muscles, they sat down to a simple dinner. The meal was as modest as their breakfast, perhaps some rice with vegetables, a leftover piece of bread, and the promise that tomorrow, somehow, they would keep going. They spoke little, not for lack of topics, but because fatigue and worry weighed on their voices. Yet their gazes met over the wooden table, its surface marred by scratches and marks left by time. In that silent exchange, they gave each other mutual encouragement. Night fell around them, and as the windows reflected the faint glow of the neighborhood's lights, they felt that the precariousness of their lives was a constant challenge. But that same precariousness heightened the value of what they had, the certainty that, despite shortages and sacrifices, their bond was their main defense against the world's threats. Without saying it out loud, they knew that no matter how hard the road might be, as long as they were together, each day ended with a spark of hope. The afternoon dragged on almost tediously over the neighborhood streets, and Josh's workday had been especially exhausting. He had lifted more boxes than usual, and his back reminded him of every effort with a dull ache. Stepping out of the warehouse, the sunlight turned crimson, tinting the facades with warm tones that, nevertheless, failed to soften the inner unease he felt. Physical fatigue mingled with a persistent emotional hum, an unnameable anxiety that churned quietly within him. He walked with his head down, watching for cracks in the sidewalk, when he passed by a lottery office. Normally, that storefront seemed insignificant, just another business among hair salons and small shops. But that day, the Christmas-themed posters announcing the upcoming draw seemed to glimmer with a special glow. Josh stopped, hesitating, letting the traffic and neighborhood chatter blur into a shapeless murmur around him. The idea of buying a ticket sprang up uninvited, fueled by a mixture of exhaustion, curiosity, and a secret spark of hope. He was not one to spend money on gambling, believing his situation left no room for frivolities. Yet that evening, he felt the need to cling to something, however improbable. He entered the shop with a furrowed brow and sweaty palms. When he asked for a ticket, his voice was softer than intended. The clerk, accustomed to hopeful customers, offered a routine smile. Josh carefully tucked the ticket into the inner pocket of his jacket, noticing his heart pounding. There was something almost shameful in the act, as if it were a small rebellion against his usual logic. On the way home, his mind churned with contradictory thoughts. What was he doing? Could he allow himself to hope for something so uncertain? Upon reaching the apartment, Suzanne had not yet returned. The room's silence was interrupted only by the refrigerator's faint hum. Josh pulled out the ticket with trembling hands, examining it under the lamp's weak light. A pang of guilt struck him. What would Suzanne think if she found out? She knew him as pragmatic, responsible. He told himself it wasn't a big expense, that it wouldn't ruin them. But the moral dilemma was not about money. It was emotional. He did not want to raise Suzanne's hopes with empty promises or feed illusions that might burst painfully on the day of the draw. He decided to keep it a secret. He slipped the ticket between the pages of an old dictionary resting on the hallway cabinet, a dusty and almost forgotten tome. It was the perfect hiding place, since they hardly ever opened it. Later, when Suzanne returned, weary and carrying on her clothes the scents of different households, Josh tried his best to act normally. They shared a frugal dinner, exchanging few words, each lost in their own thoughts. She noticed nothing amiss, attributing Josh's quietness to tiredness, nor did he dare shatter their fragile equilibrium by revealing his small adventure. That night, as he struggled to fall asleep, Josh could not shake off the thought of the lottery ticket. If he won, what would happen? They could pay off their debts, improve the apartment, maybe even open a small business of their own. He could stop hauling boxes. Suzanne wouldn't have to clean other people's homes. The future took on a different hue, as if a window had suddenly opened onto an unknown dimension. Yet fears also emerged. He worried about others' reactions, distant relatives, neighbors, or opportunistic acquaintances. Would Suzanne's gaze toward him change if they suddenly found prosperity? Would he, himself, change upon becoming rich? Without answers, Josh decided to remain silent until he had a clear plan, containing that mix of euphoria and dread inside him. Eventually, he fell asleep to the neighborhood's muffled lullaby, secretly clutching onto that slip of paper that, for better or worse, could alter the course of their lives. As days passed, Josh's life became tinted with an unprecedented tension. Although nothing had changed outwardly in his routine, his inner world had turned into a torrent of doubts and contained expectations. Each morning he rose at the same hour, made the same coffee, and left for the warehouse with the same weary determination as always. Yet the difference lay in that secret he guarded almost reverently. The dusty dictionary, silent keeper of the ticket, remained in its usual place, its yellowed pages hiding an unspoken promise. Josh noticed how the approaching Christmas lottery drawing was setting the neighborhood streets ablaze. Conversations among neighbors revolved around the lottery. Some imagined strolling along paradisiacal beaches, others dreamed of slamming the door on their debts once and for all. There were those who joked that money only brought problems, while others argued heatedly about the improbability of winning. Josh listened in silence, feigning disinterest. He feared that if he ventured too eagerly into these discussions, his words might betray the secret he guarded. While lifting boxes in the warehouse, his mind spun in circles, always revisiting the same questions. Should he tell Suzanne what he had done? Would it be better to speak openly before the drawing, or wait until he had the certainty of real winnings? Guilt and caution tangled inside him. He dreaded raising her hopes in vain, but he also feared that his silence could come across as a lack of trust. The weight of that invisible ticket in his daily life felt heavier than any box he carried. Suzanne, for her part, observed Josh with growing unease. For days now, she had sensed him more distant, more locked away in his own thoughts. When he returned from the warehouse, he often stared into space, answered in monosyllables, and became so withdrawn that he didn't even hear her when she told him something about her day cleaning houses around the neighborhood. Suzanne, worried but patient, chalked up his behavior to natural stress caused by their finances and lack of opportunity. She knew their lives hung by a thread, and that at times emotional exhaustion manifested itself in extended silences and evasive glances. Still, this distance unnerved her. In the neighborhood, echoes of the upcoming lottery grew louder. Posters with millionaire figures adorned the windows of small shops. Local radio stations repeatedly aired anecdotes of past winners. On the sidewalks, people speculated humorously, mixing superstitions with improbable advice. Josh unwillingly became a captive audience to all these fantasies, his heart pounding at the thought that he held a real, authentic ticket capable of turning idle speculation into tangible reality. At night, the apartment had ceased to be the calm refuge that once sheltered them after long workdays. The air carried a different silence, an uncomfortable pause that neither of them fully understood. Suzanne, ever conciliatory, tried to wait. She trusted that Josh would share his burden as soon as he felt ready. She didn't want to pressure him or turn their home into an interrogation chamber. But each time they had dinner in silence, she noticed a shadow in her partner's eyes, a shadow she could not decipher. Emotional tension grew like weeds in the dark, invisible from the outside, yet inexorable beneath the surface. The apartment, once lit by everyday gestures of affection and understanding, now seemed like a dimly lit stage where uncertainty set the pace. Josh, trapped between hope and fear, clung stubbornly to his secret, while Suzanne tried not to let her unease spoil the hard-won calm. Thus, the days passed, drawing the couple, unbeknownst to them, closer to an outcome that would test the strength of their relationship. The day of the lottery drawing dawned with a cutting chill, and the neighborhood streets, paved with anxious neighbors' conversations, seemed to vibrate with pent-up expectation. Josh had returned early from the warehouse, citing muscle pain to justify leaving halfway through the shift. Sitting in front of the television, blinds half drawn, he listened to the traditional sing-song voices of the children announcing numbers, as though the air were charged with a certain collective magic. The ticket was still hidden in that same dictionary, a silent talisman now thumping like a secret heart. The living room was in semi-darkness, lit only by the television's bluish glow. Josh heard the numbers and felt as though time was stretching, as if fate itself were testing his patience. Then the unthinkable happened. The digits sung out matched, one by one, those he knew by heart. First the main number, then the exact series. Everything aligned perfectly, like pieces of a puzzle. For an instant, it seemed the air grew dense, heat flooding his face. A current of electricity shot through him from the nape of his neck to his fingertips. He had won the top prize in the Christmas lottery. The initial euphoria was as intense as it was fleeting, a dazzling flash that quickly gave way to disbelief. Was it really the winning number? He mentally reviewed the figures, repeated the combination in his head, and reality admitted no doubt. Fortune had fallen abruptly into his lap, without warning, like a stroke of luck he could not control. He could pay off their debts, forget the end-of-month panic, perhaps leave that back-breaking warehouse job behind. Suzanne would no longer have to kneel on unfamiliar floors. They could, at last, begin a new life. Yet alongside these happy visions, Josh felt a sticky fear arise. If he spoke out loud, if he went public with the news, he imagined countless hands reaching out to him. Neighbors, distant relatives, opportunistic acquaintances. He feared becoming a prisoner of sudden fame, exposed to others' scrutiny as they demanded favors and concessions. He recalled stories he'd heard, rumors about people who won and ended up worse off than before, victims of scams and pressures. And what about Suzanne? Would she change upon becoming rich? Would they stop being silent accomplices and turn into mere actors performing a farce around money? This cloud of insecurity dimmed the joy that should have accompanied such a prize. Instead of leaping with delight, Josh remained silent, paralyzed. He turned off the television just before Suzanne returned from work. He sat there with his hands clasped, trying to process the abyss opening before him. He could rush forward, confessing his good fortune and trusting in others' goodwill, or he could barricade himself behind his secret, devising a prudent way to manage the situation. He did not dare decide yet. When Suzanne entered the apartment, she was surprised to find Josh sitting on the sofa, his gaze lost. Trying to steady his inner tremor, he claimed he was tired, that it had been a hard day, and muttered a few words to ward off questions. Suzanne, understanding by nature, did not press him. She attributed his detachment to their usual stress, the constant uncertainty of never having enough money, the invisible burden of bills. Still, she felt a small knot in her stomach. There was something she couldn't name, a strange spark in her partner's eyes. That night, the apartment's atmosphere seemed to stagnate, as if the air had grown heavier. In his room, Josh recalled again and again the children's sing-song voices announcing his fortune, while anxiety devoured the initial euphoria. He had won, yes, but at what cost? The money promised to save them from poverty, yet his fears threatened to spoil any harmony. Thus, what should have been a celebration of hope became a labyrinth of doubts, hiding its joy behind a veil of fear and distrust. The morning sun still entered through the same worn curtains, the neighborhood streets still bustled with their usual chaos, yet for Josh, the entire world had changed. He could feel the weight of the winning ticket in his mind, a slip of paper hidden between the pages of an abandoned dictionary. He could imagine financial security, the end of debts, the prospect of a life without grueling work. But all of this was overshadowed by a primordial fear slumbering in his memory. In the days following the drawing, his mood soured subtly but steadily. His father, a man who'd suffered betrayals in the past, had instilled in him the belief that, given the chance, people would show their worst side. Josh had grown up hearing stories of swindles, of friends revealed as opportunists, of acquaintances who, smelling money, turned into vultures. These lessons, stored in some corner of his heart, now burst forth with unexpected force. The image of Suzanne, once a warm and secure refuge, grew distorted beneath these suspicions. If she found out about the fortune, would she change her attitude, become demanding, capricious, distant, or even manipulative? Josh knew these thoughts were irrational, but he could not contain them. The notion of his partner, the woman who had shared joys and sorrows with him, becoming a calculating stranger, made him dizzy. He felt trapped in an impossible dilemma. He wanted to shout his triumph, embrace Suzanne, and plan a better future together. But the fear of being victimized by deceit and external pressure paralyzed him. During his shifts at the warehouse, these doubts sprouted like unstoppable weeds in his mind. As he lifted boxes, he imagined how the neighbors would react if they knew he was rich. The chain of thoughts always led to the same dead end: pressures, blackmail, unjustified requests. He stopped listening to the conversations around him, isolated himself from the jokes and comments that once provided some distraction. He worked with a furrowed brow, tense hands gripping the boxes, submerged in grim conjecture. At night, when he returned to the apartment, the silence between him and Suzanne grew deeper. She observed with concern that her partner had become quieter, more evasive. At first, she tried to understand, attributing his behavior to the usual fatigue or some financial worry he dared not confess. But as the dinners continued in semi-darkness, the TV off and their words reduced to monosyllables, Suzanne began to feel a tightness in her chest. Something was not right. Josh avoided her gaze, answered with evasions, and when she asked if he was all right, he just mumbled that he was tired, that work was tough, that he needed rest. In truth, his exhaustion sprang from unbearable inner tension. Each night, Josh lay in bed, pretending to fall asleep early, while his mind kept weaving defensive plans. He thought about when would be the right moment to tell Suzanne about the prize. Should he first withdraw the money, hide some of it, prepare a speech? He convinced himself that with the right strategy, he could protect himself from everyone, even from his own partner. The pleasure of fortune had turned into a silent nightmare of paranoia. The internal chasm grew, unacknowledged. There, in his own home, beside the person he once considered his greatest support, he now raised an invisible wall. Distrust had become the lens through which he viewed the world. Although part of him recognized the injustice of these suspicions, another part, the wounded, fearful one, refused to abandon its trench. Thus, without sharing, without seeking solace, Josh sank into an emotional pit where not even Suzanne's warm presence could shed light. The following days passed with steadily mounting tension, almost palpable in the apartment's still air. Suzanne, ever attentive to changes in Josh's mood, sensed something was wrong, yet she found no words or concrete evidence to explain why. He had grown more taciturn than ever. His silence, once neutral, interpretable as tiredness or thoughtfulness, now felt sharp, as if every pause in their conversation were a cutting blade separating their worlds. When Suzanne tried to start a dialogue, Josh replied with monosyllables and evasive glances. If she asked about his day or mentioned their expenses, he would just shrug or make a non-committal sound, denying her any chance to delve deeper. For Suzanne, this was perplexing. She knew economic worries could affect Josh's mood, but this new distance was baffling. She recalled with longing how, despite hardships, they'd always preserved a certain silent bond. A single glance could convey their moods, a fleeting touch could ease tension. Now, however, the lack of transparency raised an invisible barrier. Even their morning routines, sharing a watery coffee and a piece of toast before leaving for work, turned into empty rituals, stripped of the warmth they once held. Suzanne tried to approach him cautiously. In the evenings, after returning from her own work, she would sit beside him on the small two-seater sofa, leaning in slightly to catch his gaze. She asked if something worried him, if he felt unwell, if he needed to talk. Josh, more rigid than ever, shook his head or forced a smile that never reached his eyes. If she pressed, he changed the subject, mentioning tiredness or some vague problem at the warehouse. He wasn't lying, strictly speaking, but his constant evasions began to undermine their trust. In the past, Suzanne had experienced deceit in other relationships. She remembered the sharp pain that came with lies, half-truths, and evasive glances that signaled something breaking beyond repair. Now, facing Josh, those memories resurfaced. She knew that so far, there had been no direct confrontations, no dramatic scenes, but sometimes the absence of shouting and reproaches was not a sign of calm, but rather of a silent, dangerous crack. The honesty that had once been the pillar of their relationship now trembled without making a sound, and that muted shaking chilled her spirits. As the silences grew longer, mornings that had once felt warm and affectionate now seemed cold and distant. Upon waking, they no longer exchanged knowing gestures. Josh hurried to get ready, avoiding eye contact. Suzanne went about her own tasks without pushing too hard, afraid to force an answer he seemed unwilling to give. When the time came to say goodbye at the door, once a moment when they understood each other without words, now it was reduced to a clumsy, magicless exchange. Their hands barely grazed, their eyes met only briefly, and smiles faded before forming. It was as if the secret language they'd built over the years had evaporated, leaving behind an uncomfortable void. Each passing day piled atop the last, and the tension no longer confined itself to Josh's mind. It filtered into Suzanne's mood as well, prompting her to wonder if perhaps it was her fault. Had she said or done something to upset him? Was he carrying a burden he dared not mention for fear of worrying her? Uncertainty and speculation assaulted her, intensifying her sense of insecurity. Thus, without yelling or open confrontations, the first crack in their relationship became visible. A subtle gap, a barely perceptible wound to the naked eye, yet capable of widening over time. The harmony that once fueled their days lay suspended, threatened by silence and mistrust that, unnamed and unproven, began to take root in their home. Noon settled in with its harsh light, filtering through the dusty window of the storage room. It was a narrow space, more like an improvised closet, where they kept items they seldom used. Old boxes, useless utensils, a few dusty books. Suzanne busied herself there, trying to restore some order. She had decided to use her break to clean a bit before the clutter became too much. As she moved a shoebox full of loose keys and worthless papers, she stumbled on something heavy. Leaning in, she spotted the old dictionary, that thick volume they hardly ever consulted, now half hidden behind a stack of faded magazines. With a slight sigh, she wondered why Josh would have left that dictionary there. She lifted the book, intending to place it on a higher shelf. Suddenly, its weight shifted. The volume slipped from her hands, falling to the floor with a dull thud. The impact caused it to open roughly in the middle, releasing a loose slip of paper that fluttered in the air before landing on the tiles. Suzanne let out a soft exclamation, something between surprise and annoyance, and bent down to pick it up. It turned out to be a lottery ticket. Intrigued, she held it between her fingers. That piece of paper, with its neatly printed digits, felt strangely familiar. Her mind quickly connected it to the neighborhood rumors. For days, there had been talk of an unknown local who had won the Christmas lottery's grand prize. Could this be the winning ticket? Her heart pounding, Suzanne mentally compared the numbers she'd heard in the street chatter to those in her hand. They matched. A shiver ran down her spine, an odd mix of astonishment and excitement. For a brief moment, she pictured the joy that kind of prize could bring, paying off debts, improving their quality of life, escaping their precarious existence. The illusion lasted only a few seconds. The next question came laced with pain. If this was the winning ticket, why was it hidden in an old dictionary? Why hadn't Josh said anything to her? The revelation hit her like a crushing weight. Suddenly, she understood her partner's recent changes, his silence, his constant evasion. He had the winning ticket, and instead of sharing the good news, he had concealed it. It was impossible not to feel hurt. Did Josh not deem her worthy of knowing his fortune? Did he think she couldn't handle the information, or that she would react greedily? The mere possibility that he doubted her integrity filled her with anger and sadness. She wanted to confront him right then and there, to run out and demand an explanation. But something inside her held back. She remembered past experiences, the betrayals that had marked her. She realized that if Josh had kept silent, there must be a reason, perhaps fear, mistrust, or insecurity. And before making a rash move, she decided to wait. She wanted to see if he would confess the secret on his own. That hopeful curiosity clashed with the fury burning in her chest, yet she contained herself. With trembling hands, Suzanne searched for a new hiding place for the ticket. Carefully, she slipped it among the spice jars on the highest shelf in the kitchen, where Josh rarely looked. She left the spices somewhat disordered on purpose, as if it were an improvised hiding spot. There, behind the paprika and cumin labels, the paper would rest, waiting for whatever came next. Her heart was pounding, heavy with restrained rage. She felt humiliated and disappointed, as if the love binding them was suddenly thrown into doubt by a single scrap of paper. Meanwhile, the apartment seemed quieter than ever, as though bracing itself for the tension of their next encounter. Suzanne, wounded, knew that this discovery upset the fragile balance they had maintained, opening the door to a duel of wills and unspoken truths. Deep inside, she harbored the certainty that things would never be the same again, that the invisible crack had begun to widen dangerously. The following days passed with oppressive heaviness. At the first opportunity, Josh sneaked into the storage room. He pretended to look for a tool, to rearrange a few boxes. When he thought himself free of any watchful eyes, he took the old dictionary and opened it, searching for the ticket. Its absence sent an icy jolt through his gut. He flipped through the pages one by one, shook them with contained desperation, but the 10th of a lottery ticket did not appear. A cold sweat beaded at his nape. It was impossible for wind or chance to have made it vanish. Someone must have taken it. His first suspect, painfully and contradictorily, was Suzanne. Could it have been her? The thought tied his stomach in knots. The rest of the day, while hauling boxes in the warehouse, he grappled with torturous guesses. If Suzanne had found it, why wasn't she saying anything? Was she using silence to force him to confess? The insecurity and fear that had kept him quiet now morphed into a slow-acting poison, feeding his distrust. He was trapped in his inability to speak frankly, and now that trap was closing in on him. Upon returning to the apartment, he found it strangely still. Suzanne was in the kitchen, placing spices on a high shelf, her hair tied back and her face unreadable. Josh approached cautiously, trying not to betray his nerves, and began probing the terrain without admitting anything. He adopted a posture of forced curiosity, making ambiguous comments about the neighborhood and the lottery everyone was buzzing about. His questions were unsubtle detours. He mentioned having lost an important paper without specifying what. Suzanne, unruffled, replied with monosyllables and vagueness. She seemed to be playing the same game, sidestepping the verbal snares he set. Suzanne's demeanor was cold, like a white wall without cracks. She gave no hint of confirmation. When he asked if she'd seen any strange document, she just shook her head and shrugged. If Josh raised his tone, trying to provoke a reaction, Suzanne remained calm, answering with distant serenity that only heightened the tension. Her gaze was neither aggressive nor warm. It was steady, the look of someone guarding a secret deep within her chest and refusing to let it go. As the hours passed, the atmosphere became almost unbreathable. They watched each other warily, measuring every word. The television stayed off, the living room light seemed dimmer, and even the neighborhood sounds arrived muffled by the tension filling the walls. Not even their daily tasks restored a semblance of normality. When one washed dishes, the other pretended to read a magazine. But in truth, both observed each other out of the corner of their eyes, studying each subtle expression, seeking signs of guilt or weakness. In this atmosphere of subtle hostility, the trust that once protected them shattered, falling apart into imperceptible fragments. There were no direct insults or open accusations, but the silence spoke louder than any shout. A nameless gulf opened between them. What had started as a poorly kept secret had now become a duel of wills. Neither yielded, neither gambled on the truth. The hours passed under the sensation of being in a minefield, where each phrase could trigger an emotional explosion neither seemed to want, but both feared. The apartment, once a haven of understanding, had turned into a sealed box, filled with tension and suspicion. The lack of honesty, fear, and pent-up anger formed a tangled web that ensnared them, pushing their relationship into unknown, treacherous territory. A place where the word "us" began to ring hollow, and silence emerged as the only, but painful, answer. Mistrust took root in their home like a permanent guest, silent and oppressive. If before the apartment was a refuge, now its walls seemed to close in more each day, suffocating them. Josh could not stop thinking about the missing ticket and Suzanne's impassive attitude. His imagination conjured up dark scenarios. He pictured her plotting how to blackmail him, imagining ways to demand a share of the money in exchange for her silence, or how she might use her find to manipulate him. Paranoia kept him awake, eyes open in the darkness, listening to Suzanne breathe and wondering when she would turn into a stranger capable of betraying him. Suzanne, for her part, felt wounded in the depths of her pride. It was not just about the secret of the ticket. It was the painful certainty that Josh had never trusted her from the start. The fact that he'd hidden something so momentous from her, denying her the joy of sharing and planning their future together, made her think he had never truly considered her his equal. It was as if, in Josh's eyes, She didn't deserve a part in the future that money promised. That thought enraged her, but it also tore at her heart. Each time she recalled the complicity they once shared, bitterness twisted her stomach. The nights, now stripped of their former warmth, stretched into endless hours of insomnia. In bed, back to back, each feigned sleep while their minds churned with unanswerable questions. The tension was palpable, hanging in the air like a sour perfume. Mornings found their breakfast reduced to a mere mechanical act. The toaster worked, the coffee steamed, but their glances carefully avoided the latent truth. Neither dared name the issue consuming them, for they feared that giving it voice would shatter the fragile equilibrium and spark an open confrontation. At work, Josh retreated into sullen silence, keeping his co-workers at a distance. Hauling boxes with a head full of paranoid thoughts was exhausting. Sometimes he dropped something and cursed under his breath, blaming his nervousness for his clumsiness. Suzanne, meanwhile, dealt with cleaning other people's homes, biting her lip to keep from crying amid her chores, containing the rage and sorrow simmering beneath the surface. Each house cleaned, each floor scrubbed, reminded her of her own precarious status. Now, with a winning ticket lurking in the shadows, that contrast was more painful than ever. In the afternoon, when they found themselves under the same roof again, they kept their distance like two strangers forced to cohabitate. The sofa where they once sat to share small confidences had lost its warmth. The television, often silent, projected images without managing to distract them from the discomfort. They didn't openly fight, but resentment was present in every gesture. Words, when they dared to appear, were short and curt, laden with implicit reproach. The apartment that used to be a nest of understanding had now become a stage for tense silences. The plans that fortune could have enabled, paying off debts, easing their burdens, maybe starting a business or taking a vacation, now felt distant, unreal. Instead of granting them relief, the prize acted like a slow poison eating away at their relationship. Josh's anxiety, Suzanne's wounded pride, the absence of honesty, and their mutual fear were tangled together, forming a knot impossible to untie. So the days passed, one after another, both imprisoned by their own paranoia and resentment. Without saying it aloud, they understood they had entered an unexplored, hostile territory. Their harmony had vanished, leaving in its place an intense cold that pushed them ever further apart. The money, which so many people desire, had taken root in their home like a poisonous seed, placing mistrust at the very heart of their bond. The day the tension finally exploded, the apartment seemed shrouded in thicker twilight than usual. The air, heavy with resentment and suspicion, had become unbreathable. Josh, his hands pressed against the table, armed himself with a weak but desperate resolve. He could no longer bear the suggestive silence, the lack of answers. He needed to know, even if he didn't know how to ask clearly. He waited until Suzanne finished washing the lunch dishes. She noticed his charged gaze, the way he watched her from the kitchen's threshold, and felt a chill run down her spine. When she turned around, drying her hands on a cloth, Josh clumsily drew breath. "Have you seen something?" he finally asked, his voice subdued. Suzanne looked at him without blinking. She knew what he meant, but refused to make it easy for him. Deep down, she hoped he would abandon his half measures, that he'd be capable of openly stating what he was talking about. However, Josh remained in the dark realm of insinuations. "Something? What do you mean?" She responded with feigned indifference, putting the cloth into a drawer. The anger contained in Josh's chest emerged in the form of brittle, ambiguous words. He mentioned an important piece of paper, a matter he'd recently lost. He avoided the word ticket and didn't say money out loud, but every hint was a dagger. Suzanne, listening with her arms crossed, felt her dignity tested. He was accusing her without saying it outright, suggesting that she had something that did not belong to her. "I don't know what you're talking about," Suzanne insisted, her voice firmer than she expected. "If you lost something, Why not say it clearly? Josh clenched his jaw. His eyes were a mixture of fear and resentment. He did not dare pronounce his suspicion openly, to confess his fear of betrayal, to acknowledge that he had hidden a ticket worth a fortune. Doing so would expose him, reveal his weakness, his lack of trust in her. So he preferred to attack covertly, without admitting his own deceit. "I know you know what I mean. Don't treat me like a fool," he said, harsher than usual. That hurt Suzanne like a slap without a hand. She wanted to shout that she was neither a thief nor an opportunist, that all she wanted was honesty. She wanted to remind him that they had shared poverty and hope, sleepless nights and grey days, that their relationship had sprouted from mutual trust. But she held back. Her pride kept her from taking that step. If he wanted to see her as an enemy, so be it. She wouldn't pave the way to the truth for him either. "I'm not treating you like a fool. I just don't understand your insinuations," Suzanne replied, with a coldness she didn't know she possessed. Their exchange continued, dry and biting. Neither raised their voice to a shout, but their words were sharper than any knife in the drawer. Each sentence contained reproaches, implicit accusations, a subtle poison seeping through syllables and silences. Josh longed for Suzanne to confess, to slip up, to display guilt. She, on the other hand, hoped he would stop playing guessing games and dare to face his own fears. Getting nowhere, they reached an impasse. Hostility filled the space, settling between them like a silent, cruel third party. There was no reconciliation, no apology. Only the certainty that the once invisible crack now lay exposed and growing uncontrollably. By the day's end, the couple who once shared secrets without speaking had become two strangers incapable of uttering the truth. An observer might understand that any path to understanding would now be arduous and painful, full of obstacles that, at that moment, seemed insurmountable. The atmosphere in the apartment had become suffocating. After the failed confrontation the previous day, silence was no longer a haven of peace, but a minefield of invisible reproaches. Josh and Suzanne tried not to be in the same room at the same time. He stayed in the living room, pacing with heavy steps, while she remained in the kitchen, scrubbing dishes with mechanical vigor that betrayed her internal unrest. The reigning tension was so dense, it seemed to taint even the light filtering through the faded curtains. Before, their silence had been a shared language. A single glance sufficed to understand the other's weariness, a slight smile to ease everyday worries. Now, the absence of words was a solid wall, an abyss neither seemed willing to cross. Suzanne, seated at the small dining table, fixed her gaze on some imaginary point, recalling the unspoken promises of the past. She wondered how they had ended up here, how a mere piece of paper had undone the harmony they had worked so hard to build. Suzanne had never been naive. She knew how harsh the world could be, had seen manipulation and betrayal up close in previous relationships. Yet with Josh, she thought she'd found a refuge, a space where honesty flowed without being forced. Now, staring at the empty space before her, she tasted bitterness. Josh had not included her in the future they once dreamed of together. They had planned simple goals, gradually climbing out of their economic pit, aspiring to more than bare survival. And suddenly, he had excluded her, turning what might have been a blessing into a throbbing wound. As she cleaned the dishes with determination, Suzanne let her mind wander down the paths of what could have been. How many times had they consoled each other after a hard day? How many nights had they shared confidences in the dim glow of the living room lamp? Now those images were tinged with deep sadness. A single ticket, a piece of paper with printed numbers, had blown up the foundation of their trust. Suzanne imagined the words she yearned to hear, almost tasting them. A sincere confession of fear, "I'm sorry, I didn't know how to handle it." A gesture of vulnerability that would let her understand and forgive. Instead, she got evasions, hostility, and a silence heavy with resentment. Josh, for his part, wandered around the apartment with a furrowed brow. He knew the money could change their lives, but now he only felt the weight of having hidden it. His thoughts spun in circles. If he couldn't trust Suzanne, then who could he trust? His past and his family's warnings had instilled caution and fear of being swindled, and now he saw it all confirmed before his eyes. He couldn't help but think that this disaster was the product of his own insecurity, but instead of admitting it, he clung to his fears, digging the trench between them even deeper. The tension between them was not just the product of the prize and its material implications, but also of their inability to communicate. Pride, inherited hurts, ghosts of the past, all combined to form an insurmountable barrier. The apartment, with its peeling walls and modest furniture, felt smaller and more stifling than ever. Thus, with each plate Suzanne dried and stored on the shelf, with each aimless, clumsy step Josh took, their emotional distance grew. A mere conversation or a half-hearted apology would no longer suffice. The wound lay open, and the blood it shed was not just from a betrayal involving money, but from the betrayal of trust, of the unspoken loyalty that had united them. In that harsh silence, they both understood, though without saying it, that they had entered a new phase of their relationship, one in which pain and mistrust separated them, threatening never to let them return to who they once were. The afternoon was charged with a silence before the storm. Throughout the day, tiny sparks had flown between them, minimal reactions that foretold an imminent explosion. Josh had long been brooding over unspoken accusations, and Suzanne felt discomfort pounding in her chest, anticipating something worse than the muffled tension of recent weeks. It was as though the atmosphere, heavy with withheld reproaches, had finally reached its boiling point. It was in the living room that the inevitable confrontation found them. Josh stood, his back to Suzanne, pretending to examine a bill. Suzanne, arms folded, waited for some sign, some word that would help her understand. What she received, however, was Josh's hardened stare, a look that seemed to contain years of accumulated distrust and fear. "I don't understand what you're waiting for," he spat out, tense, his voice not quite a shout but with a perceptible edge. "If you wanted to tell me something, you should have done it by now." Suzanne frowned. She knew he was referring to the ticket, the secret both had turned into an invisible battleground. She couldn't believe he was pressuring her that way, disguising his guilt as a complaint. Her tone responded, acidic, though still not shouting. "And what am I supposed to say, Josh? What do you expect me to admit when you haven't even given me a chance to understand why you're acting like this?" Josh's hands curled into slight fists. He felt rage and panic mixing in his chest. In Suzanne, he saw someone who, according to his runaway imagination, must be plotting something with that ticket. He dared not say it outright, but every one of his words was steeped in suspicion. "Don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about. I've been looking for it for days," he said, alluding to an unnameable object, an it that was suffocating them both. "And you?" Not a word. Suzanne felt a stab in her stomach. It was clear. He believed her guilty, considered her complicit in a non-existent scheme. She pressed her lips together before replying, aware there was no turning back. This wasn't just about the ticket anymore. It was about the fact that Josh had never given her the benefit of the doubt, had never fully trusted her. "Do you really think I'm playing games with you?" she answered, her voice trembling with contained bitterness. "Look at yourself. You're not even able to speak plainly. You accuse me without stating the accusation out loud. You question me without admitting what you're looking for. You—" She hesitated a second, swallowing hard. "You never trusted me, did you?" The question hung in the air, striking Josh like an invisible punch. He had no honest reply to offer, because deep down he knew fear had guided him all along. The money, instead of giving him peace, had plunged him into a state of constant paranoia. And now, facing Suzanne, that truth hurt more than any blow. "Don't come at me with nonsense," he managed to say, his voice somewhat louder now, though still not a shout. "If anyone in your position had—" He didn't finish the sentence. Suzanne understood the meaning. Anyone would have tried to take advantage. He lumped her together with the opportunists he'd imagined, seeing her as a threat. That implicit acknowledgement wounded her deeply. The apartment, so small and worn, seemed to shrink before their eyes, trapping them in an emotional nightmare with no escape. Each retort, each subsequent silence, drove another nail into the coffin of their mutual trust. The promise of a better life, of a financial rescue that might ease their hardships, was now the source of unbearable pain. The ticket, once a symbol of hope, had turned into an invisible weapon that relentlessly wounded them both. Without frenzied shouting, but with words as hard as stones and looks full of reproach, they both understood that they had crossed an invisible line. Nothing would ever be the same after that exchange. The wound, once hidden beneath tense silences, now bled openly. And in the apartment's suffocating air, the certainty floated that their relationship had just changed forever. Night had spread a blanket of total silence over the apartment, a dark mantle covering every corner. Outside, the street slept, barely disturbed by the distant passing of a late-night vehicle. Inside, Josh's absence was a deafening void. He had left early, claiming the need to work overtime. Maybe he sought to escape the suffocating air they'd breathed in the last few hours. Perhaps he looked for refuge in the mechanical routine of hauling boxes, a task that required neither transparency nor sincerity. Suzanne was alone. She moved slowly through the rooms, feeling the gentle creak of the floor under her bare feet. It was cold, not so much in the air as in her soul. The apartment's atmosphere was heavy, an unspoken witness to the deterioration of their relationship. The walls, once so ordinary, now seemed to watch her with silent severity, reminding her of all she had lost. She stopped in the kitchen, beside the shelf where she had hidden the ticket. Only a few days ago, when she found it tucked inside the dictionary's pages, she decided to relocate it to that domestic corner, her secret hiding place, a spot among spice jars and food containers. With trembling hands, she moved a jar of paprika aside, feeling around until she found the paper, crumpled but intact. She pulled it out slowly, as if it were a fragile object that might explode at the slightest pressure. Holding the ticket in the faint light seeping in through the window, Suzanne studied the winning numbers. She remembered the neighborhood's voices, the excitement that had hovered before the drawing, and how that scrap of paper could have changed their fate. She could imagine in some alternate universe celebrating alongside Josh, jumping up and down in their cramped little living room, making plans together. The prospect of paying off debts, leaving behind humiliating, back-breaking jobs, had been replaced by immense sorrow. She no longer felt any excitement. The ticket no longer represented any improvement in her life, but rather the confirmation of an irreparable fracture, the lack of trust Josh had shown her. He had preferred silence, deceit, suspicion, rather than having the courage to open up and tell her the truth. He had chosen to believe she might betray him instead of valuing the loyalty she had shown him for so long. Suzanne closed her eyes. Tears came effortlessly, sliding down her cheeks without a sound. It was a silent cry, mute as the early morning, filled with unanswerable questions and promises that no longer held any meaning. She thought of the strength with which they had faced poverty together, of the complicity that had blossomed amid hardship. Now, that ticket took on an ironic meaning, the symbol of an opportunity they would never truly enjoy, because their trust had broken first. Then, with painful resolve, Suzanne took the ticket between her fingers and began tearing it into pieces. Each rip was a stab to her heart, an extreme and irreversible gesture. She knew what she was doing, destroying not only the possibility of an easier life, but also the last hope of understanding. The money, meant to be a lifeline, now became a useless sacrifice, a total renunciation of any shared future. The fragments fell slowly, like snowy flakes of paper, onto the counter's surface. Suzanne stood watching those white and colored shreds, the broken, unreadable numbers. Her silent weeping continued in the dimness, with no one to comfort her. That act marked a definitive before and after. If there had been any chance of saving the relationship, she had cast it away along with the ticket. In her heart, the certainty weighed that there was no return, that the distrust had sunk too deep. The night, an implacable witness to her pain, remained indifferent. Suzanne wiped her tears with the back of her hand, tasting their salty bitterness on her lips. There was nothing left to do. The ticket, faith, hopes, all had dissolved between her fingers. In that silent solitude, she understood that her gesture was as final as it was painful. When Josh returned to the apartment, the sun was barely peeking over the horizon. His face was tired, his hands numb from working through the night. Yet physical exhaustion was the least of his worries. He felt a feverish urgency to find answers, to regain control of a situation that had spiraled beyond reach. He entered and found not a trace of the warmth that once enveloped them. The place felt like a half-dismantled stage, a space where sadness had dug invisible trenches. "Where is the ticket?" he asked abruptly, his voice harsher than he intended. Suzanne was sitting at the table, looking out the window with a tense, almost unreal serenity. "It no longer exists," she replied, not meeting his eyes, her tone flat and devoid of emotion. There was no overt anger, no tears, no irony. Only the dim stillness of someone who had crossed a definitive threshold. Josh did not immediately grasp the meaning of her words. He thought she was lying, trying to punish him, trying to make him feel the anguish he had inflicted with his silences and veiled accusations. With frantic steps, he checked drawers, moved boxes, opened cupboards. In his desperation, he displaced objects, shoved chairs aside, searched dusty corners that had never interested him before. Meanwhile, Suzanne remained still, observing from a distance the spectacle of his distress, her heart gripped by a mixture of sorrow and anger. Every empty space, every hiding spot without its prize, confirmed the unbearable truth. The ticket had been destroyed. Realization hit him like an inescapable sentence. Suzanne had torn it to pieces, erasing the promise of a different life, one without debts, without the daily humiliation of poverty. Josh felt his strength abandon him. The fortune he considered his lifeline had vanished in one silent, lethal gesture. "Why?" he managed to stammer, voice broken, finally meeting her gaze. Suzanne's face was pale, her stare steady, not yielding to the trembling inside her. "Because that hope did not belong to me," she answered without emphasis, as if just stating the truth took all her effort. There was no overt rancor, but a painful conviction. "The money could have been our future, but you decided not to share it with me. Without trust, that piece of paper was worth nothing." Josh felt himself disintegrate from within. He understood, with cruel clarity, that Suzanne had not destroyed his fortune. He had done it himself, with his distrust, his inherited fears, his inability to show vulnerability. Without the ticket, his failure lay exposed. He had lost not only the chance for a better life, but also Suzanne, the person who, in the midst of misery, had stood by him without demands or reproaches. Rage and terror rose up in a ragged scream. He collapsed to his knees in the middle of the living room, hands trembling, crying openly. For the first time, he allowed himself to be weak before her, but it was too late. Suzanne watched him from above, arms crossed, holding back her own tears. She made no move to comfort him. Her pain was too deep for tenderness, and her anger had become a wall that would not admit pleas. I'm sorry," Josh moaned, voice broken, tripping over his own words. He saw Suzanne remain immovable, neither backing away nor drawing closer. There was no room for easy forgiveness or words to repair the damage. The climax of their tragedy left him unmasked, facing the truth. His fear of betrayal had not prevented disaster. It had caused it, pushing him into the very abyss he so dreaded. The apartment, a silent witness to their suffering, breathed a gloomy calm. Suzanne looked at him with eyes full of infinite weariness. The future the ticket had once promised had turned to smoke. All that remained was the emotional desert he had created. Morning arrived with a penetrating chill, offering no respite. A pale, half-hearted light filtered through the faded curtains, illuminating the apartment's interior with a bleak hue. Everything seemed wrapped in an almost unreal silence, as if the walls themselves had forgotten how the everyday voices once sounded. In the center of that stillness, Suzanne made a firm decision, free of outbursts or speeches. With methodical movements, she took a small suitcase from the closet. Without haste, but without hesitation, she folded her clothes with steady hands, separating the few belongings that had accompanied her over the years. A comb, some faded photos, a pair of worn-out shoes. Each object spoke of a time that no longer existed. Her face showed no extreme anger or pain, only the expression of someone who understood that the bond she'd considered unbreakable had been shattered beyond all repair. In the other room, Josh sat, stunned, unable to grasp what was happening. After the previous night's drama, he was left in a state of empty stupefaction. There were no tears left to console him, nor excuses he could conjure. His strength had drained away when he realized the ticket no longer existed, and that with her gesture, Suzanne had rejected not just the money, but the last illusion of trust between them. He stood up, trying to approach with unsteady steps. He crossed the bedroom threshold, expecting to find Suzanne in a confusion similar to his own. Instead, he encountered her mute determination. There were no high-flown words or urgent pleas. Josh, his gaze unraveling, tried to stop her with a gesture, a whisper, but his attempt was weak, like a powerless gust of wind. She did not grant him the relief of a response, not even looking away from her task. Suzanne closed the suitcase gently, and before leaving, she paused a second at the door, gripping the handle firmly. She did not look back, did not offer explanations. The door's closing that followed was not violent but restrained, as if even in that final moment she refused to indulge in unnecessary displays of anger. The door shut, separating them definitively, like a blade slicing the invisible thread that had bound them for so long. The apartment was then steeped in an icy silence, colder still than the outside air. The rooms, the small dining area, the kitchen with its disordered spices, all seemed like an empty stage after the final act of a quiet tragedy. Josh moved to the bed and sat down, staring ahead. He had no strength to shout or to weep uncontrollably. He merely existed there, confronted by the void he had created himself. He had lost the ticket, the possibility of a different future, but beyond that, he now realized the truly priceless thing had vanished along with Suzanne. That silent complicity, the understanding that needed no words, their mutual solidarity against adversity, all had dissolved into bitterness. His distrust, fueled by fear, had culminated in this abandonment. There was no trace left of the couple who, despite their poverty, had sheltered each other. Any onlooker would feel the rawness of this ending. There were no heroes or true villains, only two people defeated by their own fears. With the weight of solitude on his shoulders, Josh understood that this outcome was the direct fruit of his inability to trust, to share the emotional burden of the secret he had kept hidden. The day would advance mercilessly, and the apartment would remain in that abrupt silence. Nothing would disturb the hush after Suzanne's departure. Josh, sunk into his own abyss, realized there was no turning back. His old fears, the ones that had dictated his actions, now demanded their highest price, his irreversible loneliness. The days following Suzanne's departure merged into one another in a grey monotony. Josh rose each morning without hope, feeling the weight of the silence in the empty apartment, as though the very atmosphere had thickened after she left. There was no one to greet with a sleepy, understanding glance, no coffee shared over the rickety table. Before, even in scarcity, the mornings held a quiet warmth, a hidden hope in each gesture. Now, the air felt motionless and ice-cold. Josh left for work without haste or motivation. He walked with his head down, avoiding the neighbor's eyes. No one asked about Suzanne, for it wasn't entirely unusual that their simple lives would undergo silent changes. The people in the neighborhood had enough problems of their own to meddle in others, and he appreciated this indifference, since he wouldn't know what to say or how to justify the emptiness left behind that closed door. At the warehouse, he simply carried out his routine tasks, lifting boxes with the same mechanical discipline as always, but without the slightest trace of hope. Before, sometimes he imagined that things would improve, that constant effort would bring rewards. Now, his mind roamed across a barren plain, directionless and aimless. During breaks, he kept away from conversations. He avoided his colleagues' glances, and they, sensing his despondency, refrained from commenting. They didn't know the story that had played out behind those unseen walls, and Josh found no words to tell it. What could he say? That a winning lottery ticket, bearer of fortune, had actually been the seed of emotional ruin? That his own distrust had wiped out the affection he so valued? No, better to remain silent. No explanation would restore what was lost. At night, the apartment was an empty shell. Josh sat on the sofa, the same one where he and Suzanne once shared knowing silences and quiet laughter. He closed his eyes and remembered the mornings they'd enjoyed, their small complicities, how they understood each other without many words. He recalled the smell of coffee, the way Suzanne straightened the chairs so they wouldn't wobble, the serene glances that lit the dim space. Now those gestures were evanescent ghosts, ethereal presences dissolving as soon as he opened his eyes. Material poverty was still there, of course, but it was no longer his main concern. There was a more bitter, irrevocable misery now, the loss of hope. Without Suzanne, the apartment lacked not only human warmth, but also the prospect of a shared future. Before, even in hardship, he harbored the conviction that together, sooner or later, they would find a crack of light. Now, without her, what weighed him down was not the scarcity of money, but the certainty that he had buried the most valuable affection under his fears. This sense of emptiness paralyzed him. It was as if time had frozen at the exact moment Suzanne had closed the door behind her, and Josh could find no meaning in the day to come. He went to bed late, staring at the ceiling, steeped in the bitterness of what he failed to protect. Sometimes he dreamed of the ticket torn to pieces, and upon waking, his chest ached as he remembered that those fragments were not just wasted money, but tangible proof of his inability to trust. Trapped in this emotional hangover, Josh drifted through life like an automaton. He felt no hunger, found no pleasure in food. He had no curiosity about the news, no desire to be entertained by anything. Every moment seemed meaningless. Why make an effort? Why move forward, if the person who gave sense to his struggles had left? Thus, the protagonist remained suspended in a directionless limbo. He understood painfully that the lack of trust, fueled by past fears, had robbed him of what was most precious, the loving complicity that gave his existence meaning. And now, in that emotional paralysis, incapable of facing the future, he found himself mired in a deeper poverty than any economic hardship, one not measured in banknotes, but in the complete absence of hope. Time passed with a muffled, almost motionless slowness, as Josh settled into the same sofa where he used to imagine a different life. He could spend hours there, feeling the worn fabric under his fingers, contemplating the empty space once occupied by Suzanne. Her absence was no longer just an awkward gap, but a constant reminder of the disaster he had sown with his own distrust. The apartment was silent, with no presence but his thoughts, and these thoughts, far from calming him, immersed him in a bitter but necessary reflection. As the days went by, the anger and self-pity that had paralyzed him began to give way to a starker awareness. Josh's gaze swept over every corner, and in each piece of furniture, in each object, he discovered a shared history with Suzanne. Every spoon, every cup, every frameless photograph preserved the echo of a life together which, despite hardships, had been warm and genuine. Those memories, once too painful to face, now offered him a clearer perspective. Their relationship had been the true treasure, and he had let it slip away out of fear. He realized that his greatest mistake had not been buying the ticket, nor even staying silent at first, but the systemic distrust that blossomed afterward. His inability to trust Suzanne had been the real betrayal. Perhaps he believed that by keeping the secret, he was protecting the fortune from others' ambitions, but in reality, he had denied his partner the dignity of knowing, the chance to share the weight of this revelation. With his silence and evasions, he had excluded her from the most decisive aspect of their future. He chose cowardly muteness, nurtured by old wounds, whispering that no one deserved full trust, not even the woman who had stood by him through so many of life's struggles. Examining these facts, Josh could no longer take refuge in circumstances. He couldn't blame poverty, the harshness of the neighborhood, or the random luck that gave him a winning ticket. Nor could he hold Suzanne responsible, for in the end, she had only responded to the emotional abandonment he himself had provoked. For the first time, he was forced to look inward and accept the magnitude of his errors. He knew that his decision not to share his fears had triggered every subsequent rift. The clarity he attained in his solitude was painful, but also liberating. He finally understood that if he had had the courage to confess his fear to Suzanne, his terror of being taken advantage of, his insecurity about others' reactions, things would have turned out differently. Together, they could have devised a strategy, kept the prize secret as accomplices, or decided when and how to reveal it. They could have explored as a team how to protect their privacy and future without shutting each other out. Instead, he erected a wall of silence, and it was that wall that ended up isolating them. Now it was too late. Suzanne had left, carrying in her luggage not only disappointment, but the certainty that Josh had never included her in the possibilities that money might have opened. He had to live with this painful understanding. Yet despite the bitterness, this realization was the first step towards something like redemption, even if only internal. No one guaranteed him a second chance with Suzanne. The damage was deep and perhaps irreparable. But at least honesty with oneself is the essential starting point for any change. Without that acceptance, he would have remained trapped in a vicious circle of fear and distrust. And so, sitting on the sofa where he once imagined starting his own business, taking a vacation, or simply enjoying a meal without counting every cent, Josh accepted his responsibility. It was like removing the veil from a wound to see its raw edges. It hurt, yes, but only then could it be cleaned. He did not know what he would do the next day, nor whether he might someday mend what was lost. But he understood that if there was any path ahead, it began with honesty in his own heart. No more excuses, no more running away. With his error acknowledged, he took the first step toward an inner peace that might one day transform how he related to the world. Reflecting on the chain of mistakes that had led him to his current situation, Josh could not help but recall the more distant memories of his life. Sitting on the same sofa, the apartment empty around him, he conjured the image of his father, a serious man with weary eyes who had warned him from an early age about the world's traps. He remembered clearly the stories his father told, neighbors who took advantage, supposed friends who ended up scamming him, business partners who vanished with his money. His father, whose own naivety had cost him dearly, instilled suspicion in him as a survival mechanism. As a child, Josh listened to those anecdotes with a mix of terror and reverence. He learned that trusting could mean opening the door to deceit. His mother reinforced this message of caution with constant warnings. Don't trust anyone, Josh. People can be kind in words but hide their intentions. That echo, present in everyday conversations, formed an emotional foundation difficult to uproot. The neighborhood, with its rumors and gossip about betrayals, infidelities, and scams, only fueled that distrust. Growing up, Josh understood that it was easier to suspect than to risk his heart and be betrayed. And so, over the years, distrust had lodged itself in his personality like a stone in his shoe. It seemed like protection, a shield against human cruelty. But in truth, it was a heavy, rigid armor that prevented him from moving lightly through life. He believed caution to be his best defense against suffering. Yet now, revisiting the facts that had led him to lose Suzanne entirely, he realized that same defense had become his worst enemy. The lottery ticket had been an extraordinary opportunity, a gust of hope that, handled well, could have freed them from the chains of hardship. Instead of sharing that promise with the woman he loved, Josh retreated behind his fears. He knew Suzanne had always stood by him, fighting against poverty and adversity, supporting him without hesitation. But the ghosts of his past were stronger, whispering persistently that fortune could corrupt even the noblest of souls. Thus, he did not take that step of trust. He did not utter the words that would have let them plot a common course, face the risks, and cautiously celebrate their fortune together. Now he understood the connection between yesterday's wounds and today's disaster. His father's traumatic experiences, his mother's constant warnings, the suspicious environment of the neighborhood, all had shaped his view of the world. They had convinced him that danger was the norm, that one must be perpetually cautious, that no one deserved full trust, not even the person who shared your roof and your hardships. But that defensive attitude had become a cage. By refusing to trust Suzanne, he had denied the very essence of their relationship, the mutual understanding, the warmth of knowing that, despite difficulties, they were on the same team. This new understanding was painful. He wished he could go back in time and tell his younger self that not all stories end in deceit, that sincere love exists and is worth the risk. But there was no turning back. His actions had led him to a hollow present, without Suzanne, without the prize, without the hope of a shared future. Still, acknowledging these origins was a necessary step. Understanding the roots of his distrust allowed him to see himself more clearly. He knew he had to confront those internal ghosts, those familiar voices that had pushed him into extreme caution. Perhaps in the future he could learn to lay down his arms, to show his fears without hiding, to take a chance on truth without poisoning it with suspicion. For now, he accepted the pain of acknowledging that his present catastrophe was but the harvest of seeds planted long ago, and that understanding, though bitter, was also a way to free himself from the invisible chains of the past. After several days of confinement and melancholy, one morning Josh decided he could not remain a prisoner of his own remorse. It was true he had lost Suzanne, squandered a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and that his own distrust had been the weapon that wounded their relationship. But he also understood that remaining sunk in guilt would change nothing. If he wanted to find meaning in so much pain, he had to learn something from it, turning it from a useless burden into a valuable lesson. A slight but sincere determination led Josh out of the apartment without a fixed destination. He ended up at a nearby park, the same one he used to visit with Suzanne on their free afternoons, back when life, despite its precariousness, had some semblance of balance. It was a modest place, a few green-painted benches, not very tall trees, and simple flowers in untidy flower beds. Back then, together with Suzanne, he would sit there in silence, feeling the calm that soothed the day's fatigue. Now he was alone, but the fresh air and natural light greeted him neutrally, without reproach. He settled on one of the benches, on the edge of a path along which people ambled with slow steps and peaceful faces. He took his time observing his surroundings. He saw an older couple, their hands naturally intertwined, talking in soft voices he could not make out. He thought about the years they must have spent together, the shared stories, the tensions they must have overcome. He saw children running after a ball, laughing without fear of the future. He saw a woman reading alone, absorbed in the pages of an old book, as if nothing else mattered in that moment. All these scenes seemed simple, yet profound, expressions of lives that had surely experienced their share of pain and disappointments. Breathing in the mild morning air, Josh realized that others also faced difficult times, that he was not the only one who had suffered. Although he did not know their stories, he deduced that the people in the park carried bittersweet memories as well. The elderly couple would have endured losses. The children would one day face the fears of growing up. The solitary reader might be seeking solace for her own grief in the book. Without words, he understood that pain is universal, that everyone faces internal challenges, and that some manage to emerge stronger, refusing to be consumed by resentment or bitterness. This realization did not erase his sadness or the guilt he felt for having distrusted Suzanne, but it added a new nuance, the conviction that his mistake need not define him forever. He could choose to learn from what had happened. From now on, his task would be to work on his capacity to trust, first in himself, in his own judgment, in his own dignity, and then in others. He would have to acknowledge his fears, talk about them, and stop hiding his vulnerability behind impenetrable walls. Perhaps he would not win Suzanne back. That was a painful reality he had to accept. But he could still cultivate honesty and empathy, striving not to repeat the same pattern of distrust that had taken root in his mind since childhood. In that moment, sitting on the park bench, Josh experienced a glimmer of hope. It was faint and fragile, like the first light of dawn after an endless night. Yet it was enough to remind him that his life was not doomed to repeat the same mistakes indefinitely. He could evolve, he could transform himself. He needed no miracles or empty promises to do so, only the firm intention to view the world with less suspicion and more openness. He let out a long sigh, closed his eyes for a moment, and felt the breeze caress his face. Yes, it still hurt, but now the pain was not sterile. Inside him, something was shifting into place, the certainty that, although the consequences of his actions were irreversible, he could choose not to perpetuate that destructive dynamic. He would learn from what had happened, absorb the lesson, and in time, perhaps find a wiser, more honest way to relate to others. The walk back to the apartment felt different this time. Josh walked with firmer steps, not because he had forgotten the pain, but because he now acknowledged it sincerely and was determined not to chain himself to it. Upon reaching his door, he took a deep breath. He knew that inside, in the empty space filled with echoes, lay the stage of a personal drama he needed to close. He entered without hesitation and turned on a soft lamp that cast gentle shadows on the walls. For a while he remained standing in the living room, letting his gaze wander over each object. Among simple furniture and dusty corners were fragments of his story with Suzanne. On one side, photographs, mute witnesses to brighter days. On the other, everyday objects now charged with disproportionate emotional weight. A chipped mug, a tablecloth with a small stain that once was the source of laughter, books that they rarely opened yet, whose mere presence had nurtured their shared intimacy. Josh forced himself to approach those memories without fear. He took a medium sturdy cardboard box and began collecting, one by one, those objects that reminded him of the tension that had flourished after he discovered the ticket. He did not want to destroy them or pretend they had never existed. He was simply giving them a new destination, the enclosed space of a box, a place where their energy would shift from present to past. He had understood that memory cannot be erased, but it can be transformed into experience instead of remaining an open wound. Each object he packed away brought a small pang of pain, but also a step toward liberation. The photographs, with their knowing smiles, festive day embraces, and everyday poses on the sofa or at the dining table. Seeing them provoked a bitter twinge, but putting them in the box was symbolic. He did not need to view them daily to recall what he had lost. The lesson learned was more valuable than any image of better times. He understood now that keeping those memories visible without having confronted his errors would only keep him prisoner of a broken hope. Among the pages of an old notebook, he found a list of expenses he and Suzanne had drafted one night, planning how to optimize every cent. That list, marked with small, neat, handwritten notes, was another reminder of their shared life. He packed it away too, knowing that while their intentions had been good, the final outcome was different. Money, the catalyst of their crisis, now seemed distant and irrelevant. Without the ticket, without the material promise, what prevailed was the awareness of his mistakes and his resolve not to repeat them. Placing the lid on the box, Josh felt slight relief. It was as if by closing that cardboard container, he was closing a chapter of his life. It did not mean forgetting Suzanne or that the pain had vanished. But now he no longer needed to face physical reminders of his failure every day. He could harbor within himself understanding and the humility of accepting responsibility, while also granting himself permission to keep living and reimagining his future without dragging these objects like anchors. The apartment remained empty, undoubtedly. One could still feel the echo of unspoken words and lost opportunities. But that emptiness was no longer a prison of reproach. It had become a blank canvas. Josh understood that the gap remained, that it was part of the maturity he had gained at the cost of pain. He could not fill that space with excuses or unfounded promises. He had to learn to live with it, letting it serve as a reminder that affection is fragile and precious, that trust is built with honesty and courage, and that when distrust is left unaddressed, it can unravel even the strongest bonds. With the box closed at his feet, Josh sat down to breathe in the apartment's silent air. Moving on would not be easy, but at least now he understood the price of his actions and how he could turn them into lessons. Afternoon crept by slowly, and the sunlight filtered softly through the faded curtains. Josh sat once again on the sofa that had witnessed so many emotions. Without Suzanne by his side, without the ticket promising a sudden change, the apartment's silence took on a different tone. It was no longer the oppressive silence of guilt or suspicion, but a fertile silence, a necessary pause to recognize himself. After all that had happened, he had learned that his greatest enemy did not lurk outside, in the neighborhood streets or in others' eyes, but inside his own mind, rooted in paranoia and his inability to trust. It had been a painful journey. Suzanne's absence still hurt like a badly healed wound. He would not win her back with pleas or belated promises. The money, which once seemed the key to a better life, had turned out to be a decoy leading him to expose his darkest fears, revealing them instead of overcoming them. Yet understanding this was already a form of liberation. He observed the apartment with a serene gaze, noting the empty corners and the stains on the walls they never bothered to fix. He could remain lamenting what was lost, but he had decided not to. He now knew with clarity that trust, honesty, and the courage to show vulnerability were the true strengths of a relationship. Without them, any promise of material change, any figure in a bank account, was meaningless. Josh took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the warm air drifting through the room. It was a simple act, but it felt significant, as if every inhalation and exhalation cleansed a bit more of the crust covering his wounds. He did not need forced reunions or storybook happy endings. What he required was this inner calm, this clarity that his past mistakes did not define his future unless he allowed them to. He stood up, leaving behind the sofa's refuge. His gaze fell on the window and the quiet street extending beyond its dull glass. He imagined life out there, people making mistakes and learning, people losing and trying again, lovers embracing as they overcame their fears. In that ebb and flow of stories, he was just one more person, a tiny piece in the grand mosaic of existence. He was not obliged to repeat his failures or to settle for the shadow that distrust had cast over his days. In the end, he understood that true wealth was not in the prize he never enjoyed, but in the wisdom extracted from his suffering. He had taken a firm step toward an inner peace forged through reflection, humility, and acceptance. The past would remain in his memory, but now as a reference point, not as chains. With that conviction, Josh opened the window slightly, letting a soft breeze enter the apartment. He was no longer the fearful man hiding secrets, but someone who, without ignoring his scars, was ready to face the future with maturity. He had finally learned that beyond money, What truly mattered was mutual trust and honesty, treasures he must first cultivate within his own conscience. The story of Josh and Suzanne is a painful reminder that when money becomes the axis of one's concerns, it can distort the very essence of human relationships. They shared a simple, loving life, sustained by mutual affection despite material hardships. Yet the arrival of a lottery ticket, that symbol of fortune which could have eased their precariousness, proved to be the seed of distrust, incubated in fear and insecurity. The tragedy ultimately lay in the misguided beliefs that shaped Josh's perspective. His mind, trapped by the scars of the past, drove him to see threats where there was partnership, to fear betrayal instead of relying on Suzanne's honesty. Thus, the value of money overshadowed the value of trust, and the bond that once protected them from the outside world shattered under suspicion. What should have brought them relief instead became a catalyst for tension, and what was meant to improve their lives ended up ruining them from within. This story shows that if a relationship is not founded on transparency and mutual faith, if it is not tended with sincere honesty and empathy, money becomes a corrosive factor. When the relationship's center is not affection, honest communication, and reciprocal understanding, every gesture is interpreted as a hidden maneuver, and every silence fills with unspoken accusations. The purity of a bond cannot survive if people take refuge in fear, if they are unable to tell each other the truth and face their doubts by sharing their vulnerabilities. The greatest lesson this story offers is that love and human closeness are infinitely more valuable than any sum of money. A prize is worthless if it destroys complicity, if it sows distrust that severs the deepest roots of intimacy. Josh learned too late that the most valuable currency in life is not the one in your pocket, but the one expressed in an outstretched hand, a trusting gaze, and sincere words. For this reason, one must never forget that relationships should be built on foundations more solid than financial security. Love, understanding, and the courage to be transparent must take priority over material gain. Only then can we preserve the dignity of shared affection, the inner wealth that comes from knowing you are honestly accompanied. Otherwise, fortune itself becomes a flame that consumes harmony, leaving, just as in Josh and Suzanne's story, a void that all the money in the world cannot fill. Thank you for staying with us until the end. We hope you enjoyed this experience as much as we did. Don't forget to give a like, share this video, and subscribe if you haven't yet. We'll see you again soon with more content. Take care and see you next time.